This video is sponsored by Epic Loot Jewelry. More on them at the end of the video. Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Welcome to another installment of AoE2 Civilizations vs. History, this time looking at the Vikings. The goal of this video isn't to give strategy advice, but instead to highlight the inspiration behind the Vikings units, bonuses, and techs. We'll start with a historical overview of the Vikings to provide a bit of context and backdrop before then diving into how that connects with the game. With that, let's begin our journey. The first important question is, who are the Vikings? There's sometimes a misconception that it means any Scandinavian person in the Middle Ages, but Viking was an occupation and only refers to the seafaring Norse pirates, traders, and settlers during a window of time called, fittingly, the Viking Age. That's not to say that it had to be a full-time profession though. Here we meet Svend, who's just a simple Norse farmer for most of the year. But for 2 weeks this summer, Svend has a side gig. He joins 50 of his friends in a warband to set sail for England, and now he's a Viking. A few days later, after a bit of pillaging, they head back with their loot, and he becomes Svend the Norse farmer again. The generally agreed upon beginning of the Viking Age is in 793, with the sacking of the Lindisfarne Monastery. This wasn't the first, but the earliest infamous example of a Viking raid in modern-day England. Monasteries in particular were ideal for Vikings, as they tended to be places that accumulated easily transported wealth while also being isolated and almost completely undefended. Shortly after, we know Vikings also started to appear in Ireland and Frankish territory as well. These initial raids were relatively small and stayed close to the shore, but became larger and further inland over the following decades, as stories likely spread about the easy wealth to be had. Now, why exactly Vikings explode onto the scene at this time is debatable, as we don't have good written sources from Scandinavians during the Viking Age, never mind the centuries leading up to it, but may have been the result of sailing innovations, which we'll discuss more when we get to their unique units. The first appearance of the Vikings in Age of Empires 2 is a standalone scenario called York. In that mission, you're acting out the legend of Ragnar's sons, leading the great heathen army which invaded in 865. This is 72 years into the Viking Age, and at this point the raids had grown into now a full-on invasion with the intent of conquest. England at the time wasn't a nation or unified kingdom, but instead a collection of small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, many of which were conquered or crippled during the Viking invasion. In the parts that they conquered, the Vikings then established what's known as the Danelaw for over a century, ruling over about half of modern England. One byproduct of this was an inflow of Scandinavian immigration and a mixing of cultures that introduced many Norse words into modern English. For example, Wednesday is thought to be derived from Woden's Day and Thursday from Thor's Day. Tuesday and Friday as well are also thought to be derived from Old Norse gods. During this period, the Vikings were not only nearly successful in conquering all of the Saxon kingdoms, but also sieged and nearly took Paris as well. Now, while most native English speakers associate Vikings with raids in Western Europe, the Vikings, especially the Swedes, had a strong presence in Eastern Europe and modern-day Russia as well. Because the region was divided between many rulers, a group of Vikings called the Rus were able to establish rule over the region of Kiev, though it seems they were then quickly assimilated into Slavic culture. It was enough of a legacy, though, that the name Russia in turn traces back to those Kievan Rus. Vikings would then travel even further and also encounter the Byzantine Empire. While they initially got off on the wrong foot, with the Vikings even trying to siege Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor later created an elite corps of personal bodyguards called the Varangian Guard, which for the first 100 years was made up exclusively of Vikings. In fact, Harald Hardrada, whom we see in the Hastings campaign as the King of Norway, was at one point in his life the commander of the Byzantines Varangian Guard. Safe to say that Harald Hardrada had quite the resume. Vikings and their descendants in fact show up throughout the Mediterranean, but didn't stop there. They even put their stamp on North American history as well. The Vinland Saga campaign mission recreates Leif Erikson's attempt to colonize Vinland, which is in eastern Canada. The mission has you taking the journey from Iceland through Greenland to the New World, encountering local Skrælings, as the Vikings called them. This is, in fact, the earliest confirmed contact between Europeans and the Americas, almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus's voyages. A small correction, though, is Eric the Red was famous for founding the first Norse settlement in Greenland, and it was his son Leif Erikson who attempted to colonize Vinland. As the scenario correctly points out, it actually didn't go very well for the Vikings in the New World, and it seems they abandoned the attempt fairly quickly, but it remains an interesting piece of trivia. We see the Vikings for a final time in the Battle of Hastings campaign mission, which reenacts the Norman invasion of England in 1066. One commonly proposed endpoint for the end of the Viking Age is when Harold Hardrada dies at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, failing in his attempt to conquer England just 2 days before the Norman fleet set sail on their more successful invasion. Sometimes other years, like 1000 or 1050, are used, but there's a consensus that the Viking Age ends sometime over the 11th century, from some combination of the Christianization of Scandinavia, a rise in feudalism, better defended towns and rivers among nearby kingdoms, as well as a change in the political and cultural climate. Some combination of those factors, and possibly others, seems to have made Viking a less appealing and lucrative occupation after this point. For almost 3 centuries, though, Vikings terrorized Saxons, Franks, and many others, leaving their legacy throughout Europe, modern-day Russia, Iceland, Greenland, and even Canada. So that's a quick overview of Viking history and the major events captured in the campaigns. And now let's switch to the civilization's design. We'll start with their unique unit, the Berserk, or Berserker as they're more commonly called. Now, Berserkers are popularly conceived as axe-wielding shock troops that fought in a frenzied state, wearing bear pelts and having the physique of a comic book superhero. This isn't actually too far off how they were described. The oldest surviving reference to a Berserker is from a 9th century poem, where they're said to be intrepid heroes and wolf-skinned, bearing bloody shields and spears while hacking through enemy shields. From a saga, we have a different description of Berserkers fighting without armor and being as strong as bears, immune to fire and iron weapons. In fact, the comparison with bears or wolves comes up quite often, as well as the idea that they're immune to fire. They also really seem to like biting on their shields, and that comes up in several sources. A more modern commentary on the Berserker state is that psychoactive drugs may have been involved and could help explain the characteristic behaviors. One proposed explanation suggests henbane, as it dulls pain and lowers blood pressure, which may explain accounts that Berserkers didn't lose much blood when injured. In Age of Empires 2, their most identifying characteristic is that they're one of only 2 units that can self-heal over time. The fact they gain HP while fighting means they take more damage than their stats suggest they should, and captures their ferocity and an almost supernatural resilience. This is especially true after the technology Berserker gang to increase that healing rate even more. Now, I do have to quickly bring attention to the horned helmets, which I think most people know is a fairly recent reimagining. In the devs' defense, horned helmets have become an almost defining feature of Vikings in 20th century pop culture, and adding details to make units more easily distinguishable is good game design, so maybe we can let it slide. Something else I noticed that was mentioned in the Age of Empires history section is that, being pagan, they didn't hesitate to kill churchmen and loot church holdings, and they were feared for their ruthlessness and ferocity. Personally, I think there may have been a slight missed opportunity there by not giving Berserks or Longboats +1 attack versus monks or +2 versus monastery, just as a slight nod. But speaking of which, let's take a look at their other unique unit, the Longboat, or more commonly called the Longship. In the game, their defining features are that they fire a large number of arrows, they're quick to create, are faster moving than the galley line, and excel against fire ships and dogs. Some of that is definitely on point, though in reality, longships were primarily used as transports, and even the ones specifically designed to be warships fought by boarding, at least in the most famous battles. The history section on naval warfare acknowledges that fact. In the original alpha, the longboat was designed as a transport ship, and it used a melee attack, so it did kind of look like it was trying to board the enemy, though it didn't actually capture the enemy ship. Even in a fairly late beta version of the game, the longboat can still be seen to garrison up to 5 units. Now, one of the reasons the longboat was historically so effective for the Vikings' purposes was that it had a low draft, meaning it could be used in shallow water like rivers. Its design also made it light enough that it could be moved or ported over land. These features allowed Vikings to appear suddenly, steal valuables and slaves, and then escape before a proper defense could be mobilized. It's hard to overstate that without the longboat, there probably isn't a Viking Age. The faster in-game movement is fitting with its use for raiding, and the extra arrows could arguably represent warriors being transported on board. Now, the history section specifically mentions dragon boats, and there's a few different classifications of longboats with surviving examples of hulls that the devs could have used as a reference. The one in the game could be called a drakar, meaning dragon. Unfortunately, we only have descriptions of that particular type of ship. The elongated, narrow hull, shields placed along its sides, and single square sail are all consistent with archaeological finds and the Bayeux tapestry from the 11th century. The alternating red and white stripes in the sail are a popular and iconic image as well, though historically there's illustrations both with and without that design. Now there is a practical reason to support the striped pattern though, considering large sails were made using a vertical loom, and then several long pieces were sewn together and treated to make them impermeable to the wind. Alternating colors would have been an obvious thing to do, and there's evidence that at least Norman longboats used a stripe pattern in their sails, so it's a nice detail to include in the game. But now let's move on from their unique units and take a look at the Viking Civ bonuses. The first is that their infantry have more HP. This is a notable deviation from other series like Total War, where Viking units and Berserk specifically are often characterized by low armor and health, but high attack. I actually prefer the Age of Empires interpretation, that Viking soldiers are hardy and resilient rather than glass cannons. Spear or axemen with large round shields would have been the backbone of their armies, which of course would also have included a mix of swords and bows. The shield wall in particular is also a signature tactic in popular culture. Now, no one would argue that using shields is unique to Vikings, or that they even necessarily use them more than anyone else, but the association does fit with a high HP bonus for infantry. Somewhat related to this is their unique tech chieftains, which is probably just a reference to the Nordic chieftains that ruled local clans during the time period. There isn't an obvious reason why this would increase infantry attack against cavalry specifically, other than to just balance out the fact that Vikings in the game don't have halberdier. As for that tech tree decision, I do think it's fair to say that Vikings are more closely associated with the spear than the halberd or bill. They also have a couple of bonuses for their navy, with cheaper docks and warships. Cheaper docks may reflect the expanse of their trade network and settlements ranging from Canada to the Caspian Sea. That said, at least to me, the cheaper warship bonus implies a large navy, which may not have been the best fit with Vikings. There's probably a better case for cheaper warships to be given to the Byzantines, Saracens, Italians, or Chinese, if we're looking at the largest medieval naval battles. There are some examples of large-scale naval battles between Scandinavian rivals though, which in some cases had hundreds of ships, according to sagas. Of course, with sagas, you always have to take the numbers with a grain of salt. And finally, their major eco bonus is their free wheelbarrow and handcart. Now, wheelbarrow in itself is a bit of an odd tech. Originally, it was a Chinese invention which only appeared in Europe in the later Middle Ages. The History tab describes Vikings as great craftsmen and traders though, so it could be a way to fight the stereotype of Norse being nothing more than raiders. The fact wheelbarrow is primarily a farming tech though does seem a little odd for Vikings. Many Norsemen were farmers of course, but Scandinavia was hardly the breadbasket of medieval Europe. As one possible explanation, Viking is the name of a company that makes a popular line of toy wheelbarrows for kids. Maybe a developer subconsciously made a connection between Viking and wheelbarrow, who knows. So that's their bonuses, and now let's take a look at their tech tree strengths and weaknesses. Despite having an infantry bonus, Vikings are often played competitively as an archer civilization and have fully upgraded arbalesters. There is some justification for that, as their geography was dominated by forest, so many Vikings would have used bows to hunt. The Normans were also early adopters of the crossbow, and their bolts have been found on the battlefield of Hastings. Their cavalry is more complicated. In the game, their great economy makes them a decent cavalry civilization, but they're lacking a lot of key techs. Scandinavians in the Viking Age did have horses, but they were primarily used for farming, as they were short and strong, which is ideal for pulling and plowing. At the same time, we know Vikings would opportunistically steal or extort horses during their raids for a bit of extra mobility. Famously, after the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, the king gave the Vikings horses as payment for peace. Generally, it seems Vikings only used horses for scouting and transport though, and they were dismounted before battle. Besides their late cavalry options, Vikings also miss out on most gunpowder units as well. The Swedes in particular would develop quite sophisticated strategies with gunpowder in the 30 Years' War, but that's after the time frame of AoE2, so I don't think we should make that connection. The Viking monastery as well is also fairly weak, as you'd probably expect. During the Viking Age, they were much better known for burning than building monasteries. On the other hand, their siege is fairly strong, which may seem a bit out of line with medieval pirates. That would be a misconception though, as there are examples of Vikings using a variety of siege equipment. For example, in the Siege of Paris, they reportedly used rams, catapults, and ballistas, and you can see they have the corresponding units in-game. Sadly, the IKEA instructions for the siege onager were a bit too complicated, so Vikings are stuck missing out on that final upgrade. As usual, I always like to finish up these videos with a bit of a cultural focus, and we're going to do that again in this one. Take the intro, for example, where we see a chess game between two rivals. If you look closely, the chess set they're using appears to be the famous Lewis Chessman set. A lot of the distinctive features on pieces match, and it would make sense as the inspiration, as it's a very famous set of pieces. According to the National Museum of Scotland, where some of the pieces are displayed, it says they were probably made in Norway around 100-odd years after the end of the Viking Age. In fact, one of the pieces in that set even features a Berserker, which you can tell because he's biting his shield in typical Berserker fashion. Their wonder is also from Norway and is called the Borgen Stave Church. Churches like this one would have been built after the Viking Age and Christianization, and a longhouse would probably have been more fitting for Vikings specifically. It seems clear the decision was made for aesthetic reasons though, as it's a very impressive structure. As for the Vikings in-game symbol, it's easily identified as a bird, but more specifically, it's a raven, which had a special place in Norse mythology. A nearly identical image appears on a coin minted in the 940s by a Viking king in Dublin, and according to a source from 1043, Canute the Great used a raven on his war banner. There was no official flag of the Vikings, of course, as there were countless clans and no modern-day sense of a nation, but a raven seems like a good in-game choice. Another symbol, this time in the user interface, is the Vegvisir, also called the Nordic Compass or Wayfinder. It's a well-known Icelandic sigil, though there's some debate about how modern it is. It symbolizes guidance for people who are lost, which fits with a seafaring culture, and Iceland was of course colonized by Vikings, so it has a connection. In fact, if you appreciate the beauty of Nordic symbols, then maybe check out some of what's offered by Epic Loot Shop, who have kindly sponsored this video. Epic Loot Shop makes high-quality jewelry and other items all based on Nordic symbols. They have bracelets, rings, necklaces, watches, incense burners, and a lot more. This stainless steel ring, for example, features the same Vegvisir that's shown in the game, as well as several other Nordic symbols and runes. This pendant is another one of their top-selling items. On one side, it has a Viking shield with the Nordic compass on the reverse, all surrounded again by Nordic runes. And then there's the stainless steel hand-painted Viking Drakard tankard, complete with a dragon longship head as the handle. It also comes in an unpainted version if you want a truly rustic look. Whether you're looking to channel your inner Viking or for a great gift idea, there's probably something you'll like. You can search by symbol if you have a particular favorite, and each item gives information about what the symbols represent. As you'd expect with a Viking theme, they ship it anywhere in the world, and you even get shipping for free if you use my code. These videos are very time-intensive to research and wouldn't be sustainable without sponsors and the immense help I had from Dr. Andrew Lamb, Dr. Elisabeth Magin, and TheCommentX. Feel free to let me know what civilization you'd like to see covered in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.